In the hush of a starlit night, King David's gaze fell upon a sight he should never have witnessed, a married woman, Bathsheba, in the midst of her ablutions. That singular moment of weakness would serve as the spark igniting a chain reaction of betrayals, clandestine schemes, and heartrending tragedies that would forever leave an indelible mark upon his life. Yet, it is the course of action he pursued in the aftermath that elevates this narrative to its profoundly unsettling nature. David reigned as the monarch of Israel, a man chosen by divine providence from the tender days of his youth. He embarked on his journey as a humble shepherd, tending to his flock in the pastures. It was during this time that his mettle was tested, as he displayed unwavering courage in fending off lions and bears, safeguarding his defenseless sheep from harm. In his youth, while still a simple shepherd boy, David volunteered to face the formidable Goliath, a Philistine giant whose very presence struck terror into the hearts of the Israelites. Towering at nearly 9 feet in height, clad in impenetrable armor and wielding a spear resembling a massive tree trunk, Goliath brazenly challenged any man of Israel to engage him in mortal combat. Yet fear gripped the hearts of the Israelite soldiers, and none dared to accept the giant's challenge. As fate would have it, David arrived at the battlefield, entrusted with delivering provisions to his brothers who served in the army. Upon hearing the giant's taunts and blasphemous pronouncements, David's spirit was stirred, and he could not stand idly by. Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? He declared with a courage that seemed bordering on recklessness for such a diminutive youth standing before an adversary of such immense stature. David, however, steadfastly refused the armor offered to him by King Saul, declaring, "The Lord, who delivered me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear, will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine." He ventured into the fray armed only with his trusty sling, 5 smooth stones gathered from a nearby brook, and his unwavering faith in God. As Goliath mocked and belittled him, David charged towards his adversary, whirling his sling with deadly precision. With a swift motion, he released a stone that struck the giant squarely on the forehead, causing him to crash to the ground with a resounding thud. Seizing the moment, David rushed to Goliath's side, retrieved the giant's own sword, and severed his head, securing a resounding victory that would reverberate throughout history. This momentous event not only showcased David's extraordinary courage, but also affirmed that with God's assistance, even the lowliest among men can triumph over the mightiest of adversaries. It was through this remarkable feat that David won the admiration of the Israelites, transforming into a symbol of unwavering faith and indomitable strength. David was renowned for his sagacity as a leader, his prowess as a warrior, and, above all, his profound devotion to God. He composed numerous psalms, which to this day serve as reflections of his humble and repentant heart. However, at this particular juncture in his life, a shift had occurred. He no longer ventured into battles, as he once had. While his loyal men fought valiantly on the front lines, David remained within the confines of his palace, seemingly content in his comfort. The leader who had once risked his life for the sake of his people now appeared detached and complacent. Enter Uriah the Hittite, a man whose life would become intricately intertwined with David's and would forever impact his family. Uriah was a soldier in the midst of war, not an Israelite by birth, but one of David's most steadfast and devoted soldiers. Uriah firmly believed that fighting for the king was an honor, and he was a man of unwavering principles who placed loyalty above all else. As swords clashed and arrows rained down around him, Uriah fought with a bravery that inspired others to follow his example. But while Uriah was embroiled in the heat of battle, David was strolling along the rooftop of his palace. As the day waned, he gazed idly out over the city until something caught his eye. Below, in one of the houses belonging to his people, he saw a woman bathing. David was transfixed, unable to tear his gaze away. Her beauty was extraordinary, stirring. Within him, an immediate and almost uncontrollable attraction. "Who is she?" he inquired of one of his servants. The response came quickly but carried a veiled warning. "She is Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam and the wife of Uriah the Hittite." David knew Uriah. He knew that Uriah was currently on the battlefield, fighting for Israel, and by extension for him. The very thought should have given him pause. After all, Uriah was a man of honor, a loyal servant. Yet something in David's heart caused him to hesitate. He continued to gaze at the house, as if locked in an internal struggle. The king, who had withstood countless external battles, now seemed incapable of prevailing in this internal conflict. As David grappled with his thoughts, a question lingered. In his mind, was it right for him to be here on the rooftop while his men were at war? Was the man chosen by God beginning to falter as a leader? What David would do next would forever alter the destiny of his house and his kingdom. He knew that he was about to cross a line, but the allure was like an irresistible force pulling him forward. Little did he know that each choice he made would have consequences that he could never have imagined. The night passed, but David's desire remained unquenched. He attempted to divert his attention, but the image of Bathsheba seemed to haunt his mind. He knew that it was wrong, that she was married, and more than that her husband was one of his most loyal soldiers. David could not resist. With each passing day, the thought of Bathsheba grew like a shadow. He knew that the decision to summon her was wrong, but he justified it to himself. "I am the king. Perhaps this is not so serious." With this excuse in mind, David sent his messengers to bring her to the palace. When Bathsheba received the summons, she was confused. What did the king want with her? Why was the most powerful man in Israel suddenly interested in a common woman like herself? But there was one thing she knew for sure. No one refused an invitation from the king. She went without question, as any subject was expected to do. David was anxious as he awaited Bathsheba's arrival. He knew that she would come, but what he did not know was how to deal with what he felt. When she finally entered the palace, there was an awkward silence in the air. Both knew that something was out of place, but neither said a word about it. She entered respectfully, perhaps even with fear. He was the king, after all, and what he said was like an order. David received her with a look that she could not interpret. Was it admiration, guilt, desire? Perhaps a little of everything. He invited her to sit down, and for a few moments he tried to act as if it were just a casual visit. "You are Uriah's wife, are you not?" David asked, even though he already knew the answer. For an instant, Uriah's name hung between them like a barrier that David knew he should not cross. Uriah, the faithful warrior, who at that moment was on the battlefield fighting for Israel and for his king. But David ignored this thought. He steered the conversation towards something lighter, trying to make Bathsheba comfortable. "You are highly respected. Your husband is a great man," he said as he watched her intently. She thanked him politely, but it was clear that she was uncomfortable. She did not understand why she had been summoned, and perhaps somewhere inside her, a suspicion was beginning to arise. David, however, was no ordinary man. He knew how to use words. His position as king, combined with his charisma, made him almost irresistible. He began to talk about simple things, but little by little, the tone changed. He began to praise her beauty. "You are an extraordinary woman. Bathsheba, it is easy to understand why Uriah is so devoted to you." She remained silent, perhaps trying to decide what it meant, but David's intention soon became clear. He drew closer, and at that moment Bathsheba realized that there was no escape. He was the king. To refuse a request or even to resist was something that could bring unpredictable consequences. David knew that she was vulnerable. He knew that at that moment he had the power to decide how it would end, but he did not stop. He moved forward, crossing a line that could never be erased. David approached, breaking the distance between himself and Bathsheba. His eyes were fixed on her, and his words began to diminish, replaced by a heavy silence that spoke more than any discourse could convey. Bathsheba was vulnerable. She knew that she stood before the most powerful man in Israel, someone who could decide her fate with a single word. He was the king, but at that moment, he was not the just leader that his people knew. He was a man dominated by desire. When David touched her for the first time, Bathsheba did not protest, not because she wanted it, but because she knew that she had no choice. It was the weight of absolute power. He asserted himself firmly, but also with a caution that seemed to contradict the sin he was about to commit. For David, that moment was a mixture of desire and justification. He knew that it was wrong, but he allowed his heart to deceive him, as if it was something inevitable, something that he could not control. In that room, what began as words was transformed into something deeper, more intense, and more dangerous. It was a moment in which boundaries were crossed, where desire superseded reason and power superseded morality. It was the kind of act that carries within itself a mark that never disappears. For Bathsheba, it was impossible to forget the sensation of being led to something that she did not want, but that she could not refuse. For David, the weight of that moment would remain hidden in his heart, like a shadow that he would try to ignore. When it was over, there was a crushing silence. David watched Bathsheba dress, and for the first time, he seemed to realize what he had done, but he said nothing. He was the king, and at that moment that seemed sufficient to justify anything. Bathsheba left the palace with a heavy heart, carrying with her the memory of that encounter. It was the beginning of something that could not be undone, something that would not stay buried for long. Days later, a message reached David. Just 3 words that made him realize that his secret would not stay hidden. I am pregnant. Now, he would need to face the consequences of his choices, but the price would be much higher than he could imagine. David could not take his eyes off that message. It was only a matter of time before people started asking questions. The people, his advisors, Uriah. Just thinking of the name of the man who risked his life on the battlefield, blindly fighting for a king who had betrayed his trust in such a brutal way, made David feel a knot in his stomach. But instead of remorse, his mind began to hatch a plan. He needed to cover up the mistake, whatever the cost. He summoned his advisors and ordered that Uriah be brought back from the battlefield. Tell him that I need a report on the progress of the war, David said. But the truth was much darker. He hoped that Uriah would go home, spend the night with Bathsheba, and thus no one would ever question whose child it was. When Uriah arrived, he was tired but still proud to serve the king. He entered the throne room with the same dignity that he took to the battlefield. "My king, what do you wish to know?" Uriah asked, without imagining that the man seated before him had just betrayed him in a way that he could never imagine. David asked questions about the war, feigned interest in details that he already knew, but as Uriah answered, the weight of the situation only increased. David tried to disguise it, tried not to look into the eyes of that honorable man, but it was as if Uriah carried a light that exposed the darkness in the king's heart. "You have worked hard, Uriah. Why don't you go home tonight? Rest. Be with your wife," David suggested with a smile that seemed almost convincing. Almost. But Uriah refused. He was not the kind of man who put pleasure above duty. "How can I go home while my companions are on the battlefield risking their lives? No, my king. I will stay here in the palace." It was as if the knife that David was holding was turned against him. Uriah's integrity was a silent affront to David's betrayal. Every word that came out of Uriah's mouth seemed like a reminder that he was a better man than the king himself. David tried again the next day, offering wine and insisting that Uriah rest. But Uriah remained firm. When David realized that he could not manipulate him, something inside him changed. The man who had once written psalms of repentance and love for God was now immersed in a darkness that seemed endless. If Uriah would not cover up the sin willingly, David would do it another way. David sat at his desk. The parchment before him seemed heavier than it should. He held the pen for a moment, unable to begin. What he was about to do would torment him for life. The pen touched the paper, and the words began to emerge, each one darker than the last. His hand trembled slightly as he wrote, but he forced himself to continue. What he was writing was something that no one could know, a secret that should stay between him and that piece of parchment. When he finished, David put the pen aside and looked at what he had written. He folded the parchment carefully. He summoned Uriah. When the soldier entered, with his loyal and respectful countenance, David stared at him, almost hesitating, but there was no room for regrets. He needed to maintain control. "Take this to Commander Joab," David said, handing over the letter. His voice was cold, without traces of emotion. Uriah took the parchment without questioning. "Yes, my king, I will consider this my greatest responsibility," he said with a slight smile. For Uriah, it was another mission, a privilege granted by the king whom he so admired. He had no idea that message carried the beginning of something that would change his life forever. As Uriah left the room with confident steps, David remained motionless. He stared at the closed door and for an instant wondered if it was too late to turn back, but he pushed that thought away. What was done